The Australian Financial Review.
Anthony Albanese has finally secured a meeting with US President Donald Trump 9 months after he took over the White House for a second time.
The date is October 20 this year. Put it in your diaries. Anthony Albanese will be coming back to the United States.
Australia has come under fire from Washington to do more on defence, and that's likely to be a focus when they sit down on October 20. That's why Albanese's misfire in the Pacific last week is awkward timing.
Is Prime Minister Albanese just struck with bad luck when it comes to security deals in the Pacific? Or is there something else at play?
The Australian Prime Minister attempted to sign a significant defence pact with Papua New Guinea and a security deal with Vanuatu, but they both fell through at the last hurdle after objections from China.
Well, it looks like Australia has at least been temporarily outmanoeuvred by China in the Pacific.
Welcome to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray. This week, Canberra Bureau Chief Nicola Smith and Washington correspondent Jessica Gardner on the Pacific deals that weren't, why they matter, and what to expect when Albanese finally sits down with Donald Trump. It's Thursday, September 25. Hi, Nikki. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Anthony Albanese was left red-faced last week as he failed to secure not one, but two security agreements in the Pacific. The proposal for a sweeping defence pact with Papua New Guinea would have created only the third alliance in Australia's history, so it was a big deal. There was speculation that China was behind the stalled efforts. What happened?
Well, it looks like Australia has at least been temporarily outmanoeuvred by China in the Pacific. Prime Minister Albanese had specific goals that he wanted to achieve over the past few weeks. First of all, Albanese went to Vanuatu.
A major setback hit the Prime Minister's Pacific Islands trip this morning before he'd even left the airport in Sydney,
where he had hoped to sign a $500 million deal. It's called the Nakamal deal, to boost security and climate and economic policies.
Vanuatu has pumped the brakes at the last minute and hasn't signed on the dotted line. Experts say China is likely the reason.
Vanuatu is close to China, and it balked at this idea, at least some people in the government did, that Australia should exercise veto rights over Vanuatu's relationship with third parties. And there were particular concerns around critical infrastructure projects and what that would mean for Vanuatu. Albanese then went on to the Pacific Islands Forum, which was a meeting of all the Pacific leaders. And even though China was not invited to this meeting, there were questions about its influence that overshadowed the agenda. And then on the back of that, the Prime Minister went to Papua New Guinea, where Australia wanted to sign a much more ambitious deal with one of its closest neighbours. And this would effectively have integrated the two countries' defence forces. It would have offered a pathway for PNG troops to work with the ADF and join the ADF. And this defence deal would have been Australia's third alliance and the most significant treaty since ANZUS, and also PNG's first.
And now in Papua New Guinea, where the signing of a defence treaty has been delayed. A lot can change in 24 hours.
The Prime Minister's PNG counterpart appears to be having trouble getting approval for the landmark deal.
The delay in formalising this treaty is another setback for Australia and its strategy to push back against China in the Pacific.
And one of the important things about this treaty is that it contains some kind of mutual defence provision. PNG's Defence Minister, Billy Joseph, said ahead of what was expected to be the signing that this defence provision would be similar to Article 4 of NATO's founding treaty, which says that members will consult if any of them feel their territorial integrity, political independence or security is threatened. So it really was a significant step up in the defence relationship between PNG and Australia. And it was initiated by PNG. It was initiated by Prime Minister James Marape, and that's a significant detail that PNG wanted this. It went to Australia to ask for this. This was not something that was imposed by Australia, and negotiations had been underway since January this year. And instead of this much anticipated deal, which was really being talked up by both sides in the days and running up to the potential signing, it stalled at the last minute. And there was not a quorum of ministers in the PNG government to push it through. The excuse that was given at the time was that PNG was celebrating its 50th year anniversary and that ministers were busy around the country. But really that was quite unusual because everybody knew that this deal was coming for months. PNG then said that it would send its defence minister to China and to other countries to explain the deal. That really begs the question of why. It gives the impression that PNG is somehow seeking approval from other countries on a bilateral deal. And looking at the bigger picture, underpinning all of these latest developments is Australia's goal to be the security partner of choice in the Pacific. And that's set in the larger context of this growing strategic tussle and competition between China and the United States over who has the most influence in this very strategic region. China has really increased its own relationship and influence over PNG and other Pacific nations.
The security situation is severe in the Indo-Pacific.
Last week, we had Kirk Campbell, the former top US official in the Pacific under the Biden administration, who suggested that China is trying to sabotage all of these kind of deals.
All the politics of the Pacific are increasingly contested, and the great game is afoot.
He said that China's relentless.
China is relentless, and they
uses different venues of engagement to try and block initiatives.
Block and blunt.
So Australia can no longer count on itself being the biggest player in town. It has a huge competitor in Beijing.
And Nikki, why is China so focused on the Pacific? Why is the Pacific so strategically important?
First of all, it's about location. So if you look at a map of the Pacific, you have a vast network of maritime trade routes, undersea cables, which are powering the internet. There's deposits of valuable critical minerals. And if you look back again to World War II, where Pacific Island nations like PNG, like the Solomons, served as strategic staging grounds for air and naval forces. And these allowed both Japan and the US and the Allies to project power across the Pacific Ocean. So geographically, it's an extremely important region. And this is now coming to the fore because of this strategic tussle and competition between the US and China. These routes and this positioning of the islands is becoming very important again. And for governments in the Pacific, they're really having to perform a very delicate balancing act. They're trying to maintain their economic relationships with, first of all, China, the world's second largest economy, but also recognizing that their security is very much linked to the US and its allies. And, Australia is also facing these kind of challenges. It's just not quite on the same scale. And then another point I would say is that one of the manifestations of the strategic contest that can be seen in the Pacific is over the diplomatic recognition of China or Taiwan. And what we've seen in recent years is that China has steadily built its influence across the Pacific. It has lured countries such as Solomon Islands or Kiribati, Nauru to switch their recognition to Beijing from Taiwan. It's wooed them with promises of infrastructure, funding aid, economic development. And now we have a situation where just 3 out of 14 Pacific nations, Palau, Tuvalu, and the Marshall Islands, maintain diplomatic relations with Taiwan.
And Nikki, you've lived in Taiwan and also spent time in the Pacific. How do you think these countries feel about being in the middle of this geopolitical contest?
You know, it's still in living memory for some people how terrible it was during World War II. And even those who don't have a living memory, they're facing the consequences. If you look at somewhere like the Solomon Islands, there's still hundreds of thousands of unexploded pieces of ordnance that every year maim and kill people. So it's still very much in people's minds that they don't want to be dragged into another conflict. It's also important to note that the Pacific isn't just a homogenous region. You have multiple governments, multiple complicated domestic political situations, and internal issues that everyone is trying to grapple with. And then many of them are struggling with infrastructure and development issues. And so it's not surprising if they shop around and they try to get the best deal for their population. They're looking for support from different countries. And, you know, if someone comes with a good offer, then obviously they're going to take it. And so there is an element of checkbook diplomacy as well, coming from China and Australia and the US and its allies. And there's just generally also frustration within Pacific Island nations about this focus on choosing between China and the US and aligning with either, when actually the thing that they're most worried about is climate change. And they're really on the front lines of rising tides, weather-related disasters that are linked to climate change. And this is something that's foremost on their minds.
So as you say, Nikki, it is frustrating for Pacific Island countries that they're drawn into this tussle between China and the US. But at the same time, Australia's role in the Pacific is an important one in terms of taking the lead in countering the influence of Beijing. How is Australia doing in that role?
Well, this is Australia's neighbourhood, and since the Albanese government came to power in 2022, we have really seen a step up of diplomatic efforts to shore up those ties with Pacific nations and to really project soft power and also increase Australia's security presence in the region. Often Australia talks about being a middle power, but actually when it comes to the Pacific on its own doorstep, the United States really relies on Australia to build up this network of security relationships and to exert its soft power through initiatives like development funding, police training, and just having a presence in the region. Australia has some of the biggest embassies in these countries, whereas the United States is still playing catch up in terms of its own diplomatic presence. Clearly, Australia, it doesn't have the same military might, doesn't have the same firepower as either China or the US. But when it comes to strategic influence, then it does have these long-standing relationships. And that's certainly something that Foreign Minister Penny Wong or the Prime Minister took up. And we've seen under the Albanese government that relations have also gotten better. There's a spark between Marape and Albanese. They got on very well. Albanese frequently talks about how they trekked the Kokoda Trail last year.
This walks about the future and PNG and Australia walking together.
To mark Anzac Day.
What we're doing today symbolizes that we can't take the present for granted. We too must plant our own memories, the memories of democracy, respecting each other, caring for each other.
Australia's also provided $570 million in budget support for infrastructure, aid projects, and a very significant $600 million deal on the Rugby League.
Good evening. There are celebrations tonight in the rugby league-loving nation of Papua New Guinea with the news they've been welcomed into the NRL.
Rugby league is a huge passion in Papua New Guinea.
The NRL team is going to be running on the field and get on board for them to do very well very quickly.
The deal ensured that the PNG's team would be admitted to the NRL in 2028. So obviously that's very popular with the local population. But it also allows Canberra to terminate financial support if the government enters a security or policing pact with a rival nation. So Australia has really been making every effort to build up relationships, and that hasn't always been the case. You might remember back in 2015 Then Immigration Minister Peter Dutton was caught joking with then Prime Minister Tony Abbott about rising sea levels in the Pacific, about water lapping at their doors. And that really didn't go down well.
Obviously, it was a private conversation. I should have realised the mic was there and didn't. It was directly behind me, but I made a mistake.
In 2018, then there was speculation that China was trying to establish a military base in Vanuatu, and Beijing denied this. But this raised the alarm in Canberra about the growing regional footprint of China and kind of brought it into people's minds again that China has its own ambitions in the region, and that that's something that Australia has to be across and has to be aware of. And then one of the biggest setbacks was in early 2022 when the Solomon Islands signed a secretive security pact with China.
China and the Solomon Islands have signed a deal on police cooperation, fueling unease in the West about Beijing's growing influence in the South Pacific.
That really triggered fears among Australia and its allies that Chinese naval ships and troops could be posted less than 2,000 kilometres from Australia's coast.
China just made a huge power play in the Pacific. It's setting off alarm bells in Washington and in Australia.
People were particularly alarmed because they didn't know what was in this security pact. It came shortly after the Solomon Islands had switched diplomatic allegiance from Taiwan to Beijing. That became a huge domestic political issue during the election in 2022, with Albanese at that point was in the opposition and accused the government of dropping the ball in the Pacific. And then when he came into power, this prompted the Australian government to announce a pivot to the Pacific. And while the two agreements with Vanuatu and PNG have been delayed, they're still negotiating. And all the time in the background, there's this concern about whether China is trying to undermine these deals. The timing of these delayed deals in the Pacific is very awkward for Albanese, who wanted to have them under his belt as he went to the United States to show that Australia is stepping up its security role in its own region, especially at a time when the US is pressuring Canberra to increase its defence spending, and the AUKUS nuclear submarine pact is under review by the Pentagon. It would have been great for Albanese to have had these security deals in his back pocket, but he didn't manage to do that.
Nikki, we're talking about Australia's role in the Pacific and the recent setback after not one but two security deals fell through at the last hurdle. They may still be signed eventually, but they weren't sealed in time for Albanese's visit to the US this week. How important were those deals in terms of the US-Australia relationship?
These Pacific initiatives and the ones that have gone before are part of this security and defence narrative that Albanese and his government want to highlight to the Americans, that Australia is pulling its weight in its own neighbourhood, and that defence isn't just about a specific percentage of GDP, but it's about so much more about building up relationships and rapport with various nations. We have a situation at the moment where the Pentagon is currently reviewing the AUKUS nuclear submarine treaty. There's a bit of nervousness about it. And the White House is also pressuring the Albanese government to lift defence spending. Washington is also pressuring a number of allies and NATO to increase defence spending and bear more of the burden of global security. So the government wants to build up this narrative that we are actually doing a huge amount on defence. It's not just about figures, it's also about infrastructure, it's about relationships that form a huge part of deterrence and defence of the region. This is particularly important as the US and Australia, that bilateral relationship, is facing significant challenges.
And Nikki, to talk about those significant challenges, I want to take us now to the US, where our Washington correspondent, Jess Gardner, is on the ground. Hi, Jess. Thanks for joining us in an incredibly busy week.
It has been. It's great to have the Australian contingent here in the US. I've been watching the proceedings at the UN General Assembly this morning with Trump and his extraordinary speech. And I'm just back from Phoenix over the weekend as well for the Charlie Kirk Memorial. So it's already been a busy week for me.
So we'll get to all of that, but let's start with Albanese and the Australian government finally managing to secure a meeting with Donald Trump next month. It won't happen this week while he's in the US, but they have something in the diary, and that's important because they've been getting a lot of flack from the opposition. What do you expect from that meeting on October 20?
Well, they will have a lot to discuss, is the short answer. They have had 4 conversations, Anthony Albanese and Donald Trump, on the phone, but are yet to have this in-person meeting. And as you say, we've really been waiting for when this is going to occur. There are real issues in the bilateral relationship with the US at the moment. Given our long history of friendship and economic and military alliance, these irritants in the relationship, people want to understand what's going on there. So I think top 2, what is going to happen to the AUKUS submarine pact and what relief, if any, can Australian exporters get from Trump's tariffs? Australia is in this interesting position because the expectation is this 10% blanket tariff on all of our goods that we send to the US is really immovable. It's a baseline. Nobody is paying less than that. So I think for Albanese's purpose, he wants to understand what prospect there is of getting carve-outs for Australian exporters on sectoral tariffs, in particular on steel and aluminium, and possibly on pharmaceuticals, which is still waiting in the wings. The thing is, these sectoral tariffs are big problems for just a few big companies and not really that important to the Australian economy. So I'm just not sure how far Albanese wants to push Trump on those and how hard he wants to go and what he's willing to give up in return. Still, the fact that we have tariffs on our exporters is a bit of an affront to our long economic history and the fact that we have a free trade agreement with the US. So that's tariffs. Secondly, on AUKUS, I think the most important thing that can come away from this meeting between Albanese and Trump is some sort of positive affirmation from the very top, from the president, that the US will continue to support the AUKUS submarine pact. It's a really big commitment between us, the UK, and the US. You know, we're going to spend $368 billion over many decades on this. And if the US is at all wavering in its support for the pact, then we have a really big problem in terms of our maritime defence. And I think we've done well at getting positive affirmations of support from other people in Trump's orbit, but we really need it from the president himself.
So, Jess, these one-on-one meetings with Trump don't always go well for the other person in the room. And Albanese went to the UN General Assembly this week and announced Australia's recognition of the state of Palestine. How do you think that's gone down in Washington?
Trump and his Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, have been really pretty consistent in criticising the movement to recognise Palestine this week. It's not only Australia, it's countries like the United Kingdom, Canada, France and others. And what the US, Trump and Rubio in particular, have said is that making this symbolic gesture rewards Hamas and it minimises what the terror group did to Israel on October 7 in 2023. And Rubio just today characterised it in an interview as a vanity project. But what that tells you is that in these Western democracies around the world, there is rising anger among their people about the war in Gaza and this terrible civilian death toll among Palestinians, and that Trump and the US is increasingly isolated in its steadfast support of Israel here. But I think because Australia is part of a broader group, it doesn't really undermine the relationship with the US too much. It's not something that the president really wants to go hard against Australia on.
Jess, I just want to ask you about the lead up to the Albanese trip to the US this week and also his meeting next month, because it has been quite eventful. You had ABC journalist John Lyons having a tense verbal exchange with the president. And on Sunday, you were at the memorial for Charlie Kirk, whose murder has further divided America. I wonder if you can talk us through the lead up to this visit.
That's just a regular week in my new life as the US correspondent. I've only been here for 3 months and I'm still really getting my head around the pace of news over here. John Lyons, last week, he was out at the White House in a big press pack, peppering Trump with questions before he jumped on a helicopter for his trip to the United Kingdom. And it seems like Lyons is working on a piece for the TV show Four Corners about Trump's business dealings. And he was asking questions to President Trump about the wealth that he's built while he's been in office. Trump was really quite put off by the questioning, and he said words to the effect of, "Oh, you're hurting Australia. They want to get along with me." And then he said, "Your leader's coming here next week and I'm going to tell him about you. You know, you set a very bad tone." It really was quite a diplomatic incident. I was watching it and was quite shocked. 2 things jump out to me from this little episode. One, it goes back to what I was saying before. Trump's instinct is he does like Australia. And though he wanted to rib Lyons a little bit, he could have gone much harder. You know, he is pretty gruff with the press. So maybe Lyons got off a little bit lightly. But secondly, what it shows is this pattern of Trump bullying and intimidating the media, which is raising real concerns about freedom of the press and free speech in America. And that takes me nicely to Charlie Kirk's memorial. I was thinking about it in relation to the US-Australia relationship. I don't think it has a huge direct on that relationship, but what I do think is it's really emboldened people on the right of politics over here to really continue Charlie Kirk's legacy of persuading young men and young women to this brand of conservative Christian nationalist politics. I think that death might really electrify that cohort of young people when it comes to the midterms next year. And you might see the Republican Party hold on to seats that they might have otherwise been under threat.
Just lastly, you mentioned the AUKUS review and the pressure on Australia to do more around defence. Albanese wasn't able to sign those security deals in the Pacific. How important is Australia's role in the Pacific in terms of showing its usefulness to the Trump administration? Or do you think this is something he's just not focused on?
I don't see a lot of evidence that Donald Trump is very focused on the Pacific or China, frankly. He's focused on China when it comes to economic issues. You know, obviously they had the quite damaging and escalating tit-for-tat around tariffs earlier in the year, and they've been able to simmer that back down. He's obviously been speaking to Xi Jinping about the TikTok deal of late. But when it comes to the geopolitical threat of China in the region, it doesn't seem to be near to the top of his agenda. But that's not to say there aren't other people in the administration for whom they're very focused on it. And I would say Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, and also in the Pentagon, you've got Elbridge Colby. He's one of the top policy experts and the man who's conducting the AUKUS review. You know, they are very focused on the threat from China and want to see what Australia is putting on the table in terms of how it can play a role in warding off Beijing's ambitions in the Indo-Pacific. So it's not great that we weren't able to pull off those security deals. On the other hand, Albanese can point to some recent defence investments that he's made to show how serious we are about our role in the region.
Thanks so much for joining us, Jess.
Thanks, Lisa.
Nikki, a final question for you. Do you think Albanese will be able to sign his 2 defence deals in the Pacific eventually? And what will that mean for security in the region and for Australia's key relationships with the US and China?
Well, it's important to say, first of all, that both of these deals are still being negotiated, that they haven't collapsed. And so anything is possible. I think we need to look at them both separately. So the Vanuatu deal looks like it will face stronger headwinds. And that's partly linked to Vanuatu's recent history, its relationship with China. And there's certainly concern now among some local politicians that proceeding with this deal could undermine the economic relationship with China, which makes it domestically tricky for Prime Minister Jyotam Napat. When you turn to PNG, it looks like there's a stronger chance that that deal will go ahead. So far, the Australian and the PNG governments have said, look, it's just a matter of process, that we have the wording of the deal. We just need to go through the proper democratic procedures to get it signed. And that the decision to negotiate this treaty sends a message to the region that PNG has chosen and will choose traditional partners like Australia and the US when it comes to defence cooperation. However, again, Marape is facing a difficult political environment. He has to secure that domestic political support. He has to counter these arguments that this could endanger the economic relationship with China. And his decision to send Billy Joseph to Beijing to explain the treaty already sows those seeds of doubt about its future. So nothing's in the bag until it is. If the PNG treaty in particular goes ahead, this is a very meaty arrangement and a very significant step up in defence cooperation, then it would show China that Australia is willing to be more assertive about its security in its near neighbourhood. When it comes to US relations, it would be a significant sign that Australia is a regional net security provider, and it would show the US that it's a reliable partner at a time where the Trump White House is urging allies to shoulder more of the responsibility for security on their own doorstep, and it would be welcomed in Washington. And as for the government of PNG, the security deal going ahead would offer that additional reassurance that its security is intertwined with Australia's security and that Canberra is really taking that seriously. But there will no doubt be that lingering hesitation about whether this deal could undermine or impact China's willingness to offer economic assistance and partnership. And that's the difficult balance that they have to strike.
Thanks, Nikki.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray, with Canberra Bureau Chief Nicola Smith and Washington correspondent Jessica Gardner joining the podcast today. The Fin is produced by Alex Gow and Mandy Coulin. Fiona Buffini is head of premium content. Our theme is by Alex Gow. If you like the show and want to hear more, follow us wherever you get your podcasts and consider rating and reviewing us as it helps others find us. For more stories about markets, business and power, subscribe to The Financial Review at afr.com/subscribe. See you next week.
The Australian Financial Review.